Every day, rain or shine, an old man sat by the same grave, whispering words only the wind could hear. No one knew why until one day I finally asked. What he told me shattered my heart. 60 years ago, he made a promise to the love of his life, a promise he never broke. Through war, loss, and time, he kept returning to the same spot, holding on to a love that never faded. His story wasn't just about grief, it was about devotion, about a love so strong that even death couldn't take it away. When I walked away that day, I carried his lesson with me. True love doesn't end, it only changes form. It was a crisp, autumn morning, the golden leaves scattered across the cemetery grounds like a blanket of memories. I had come to visit my grandmother's grave, something I did every other week. But that day, my eyes caught sight of an old man sitting by a single grave. He was dressed neatly, wearing an old but well-maintained suit, his hands clasped together as he gazed down at the headstone in front of him. There was something hauntingly familiar about his posture. The way he sat, unmoving, as if time had no meaning. The way his shoulders carried an invisible weight, one that years of grief had settled upon them. I didn't approach him that day. But as I continued my visits, I noticed he was always there. Every day, at the same time, sitting in the same spot. Rain or shine, he never missed a single day. Curiosity got the best of me. One afternoon, I gathered enough courage to approach him. As I walked closer, I noticed the name on the tombstone, Margaret Whitmore. The engraving was old, worn by time and weather, but the name remained clear. Beneath it, a simple inscription read, "Forever in my heart." I swallowed hard. There was something deeply personal about reading a name on a tombstone, as if you were stepping into a stranger's past without permission. I hesitated, then softly said, "Excuse me, sir." The old man slowly turned his head to me. His eyes were tired but kind, deep pools of blue that held stories I couldn't even begin to imagine. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," I said. He shook his head gently. "No, not at all," he said, his voice calm yet tinged with sorrow. "I've seen you here every day," I admitted. "I was just wondering if you don't mind me asking, who was she?" The old man's lips curled into the faintest of smiles. "She was my wife," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The love of my life." I felt a lump form in my throat. "I'm sorry for your loss," I said softly. He nodded. "It's been 60 years. 60 years. My breath caught in my chest. "You still come every day?" I asked. He smiled, this time a little more deeply. "I made her a promise." He turned back to the grave, running his fingers over the letters, as if he were tracing them for the millionth time. "I met Margaret when we were just kids," he began. "She was the girl next door. We were inseparable, always getting into trouble, sneaking out to the lake, carving our initials into the old oak tree by her house. Everyone knew that one day we'd be married." His wrinkled hands trembled as he traced the edge of the gravestone, his voice thick with emotion. "We used to dream about the future. She wanted a little white house with a garden full of roses. I promised her I'd build it for her with my own 2 hands." He let out a shaky breath, eyes clouded with memories. But life had other plans. He looked up, as if seeing the past unfold before him. "I was drafted. The war took me away from her. We wrote letters, but then they stopped coming. I came home to find her gone. No one knew where she had gone or why. I searched for years, hoping, praying." His voice cracked. "It wasn't until decades later that I found out she never left. She was here all along, waiting for me." His eyes seemed to lose focus, lost in a memory far from here. "I was drafted into the war when I was 22, he continued. "We had only been married for a year. I didn't want to leave her, but she told me she'd wait for me. 'Come back to me, Thomas,' she said. 'Promise me you'll come back.' He let out a slow breath. I promised her. The silence stretched between us, the weight of his words settling over the air like mist. "But war changes a man," he said finally. I saw things I can never forget. Lost friends. Lost parts of myself. He rubbed his hands together, as if trying to warm them. When I finally came home, I thought I had kept my promise, he said. I had survived. I had returned. But Margaret, she had fallen ill. His voice cracked slightly. She was waiting for me, he whispered. She held on for as long as she could. The doctors said she should have been gone months earlier, but she refused to go. Not until she saw me one last time. My heart clenched. I walked through that door, and she smiled at me like nothing had changed. Like I hadn't been gone for years. She reached for my hand, and I held on to her as tightly as I could. His fingers trembled as he spoke. She told me she loved me, that she had never stopped waiting. And then, he exhaled, a deep, shaky breath. And then she was gone. The wind rustled the leaves around us. I didn't even get to say goodbye, he said, his voice breaking. I felt tears sting my eyes. But I made her a promise that day, he said, his voice growing stronger. I told her I'd visit her every single day, that she would never be alone, that even though life took us apart, I would never truly leave her side. And he had kept that promise. For 60 years, a lump formed in my throat. You must have loved her very much, I said. He turned to me then, his blue eyes filled with something I had never seen before, something deeper than grief, stronger than time. Son, he said, love doesn't end just because someone is gone. He looked back at the grave and placed a single white rose on it. It just changes form. I wiped my eyes before he could notice. Do you ever regret not moving on? I asked. He smiled. Margaret was my life, he said. Loving her was the greatest privilege I was ever given. There was no need to move on. I have lived a good life, built a family, but my heart has always been hers. I swallowed the lump in my throat. Thank you for sharing your story with me, I said sincerely. He nodded. Thank you for listening. As I turned to leave, I looked back one last time. The old man was still there, sitting by his wife's grave, lost in the past but at peace in the present. And I knew then that true love, the kind that withstands time, sorrow, and even death itself, wasn't something you read about in fairy tales. It was real. And it was right there, in the quiet devotion of an old man who never stopped loving the woman he lost. That day, my heart carried something new, an understanding of love that few would ever witness. And as I left the cemetery, I found myself whispering, may we all be lucky enough to love and be loved like that.